All right, I'm always aware of the dubious distinction one has of eating when there could be food. So, I promise to keep this quick and relatively high level. So, it's always extraordinary pleasure to get to come and talk in rooms like this to people who are well outside of my field. There's something kind of interesting about imagining how I can take what I know and make it relevant to all of you. So, I want to start by thanking Wally and acknowledging that I am back on the normal country and what a lot that means to me. I'm a child of Australia. I grew up all over Australia, and for me, one of the lovely things about getting to come home is that you get to acknowledge that you stand on the oldest occupied country in the world. And that we start every function with that is, for me, something really powerful. It's not something they do in America, although all the conditions still apply. And for me, getting to come and always remember that is one of the great pleasures of getting to be home, and one of the great responsibilities of it too. So we're here to talk about the future of business. I actually don't think you can talk about the future without always being conscious of its past. So I can't go back 60,000 years to talk about the future of business, but I want to go back 300. And I want to tell you a story and then tell you why I'm telling you that story. So back in 1718, a very long time ago indeed, a man named Thomas Newcomb, who was a lay preacher and a blacksmith and a wheelwright, and he lived in England. In that year, he built the very first commercially available steam engine in the world. It was 2 stories high. It was the loudest thing that had ever been turned on the planet. And when he first built his very first one, that 2-story object sitting inside a brick house atop a mine in Cornwall, he built it because he was concerned that people were dying in the mines because the water flooded the mines and people couldn't get out fast enough. And so he built a machine that would pull water from the bottom of mines to save lives. It was the first steam engine. It was called an atmospheric engine, in fact. Some of you learned about Watt in school, but the first engine is actually Thomas Newcomb's. And for nearly 100 years after the introduction of that engine, all the mines in Britain ended up with that engine because it saved lives. It made it a safer place to work. It made the mines more efficient. And other people saw that engine and thought, we could probably make that not just power a pump to get water out of a mine, but power a turbine and power a piece of machinery in the factory. And that engine moved slowly and steadily from those mines into factories all over Britain. And it changed the way work was done. It was the beginning of what we know as the Industrial Revolution. But the basic tenets of that steam engine didn't change. It was large, it was cumbersome, it was noisy, it required an enormous amount of fuel and an enormous amount of water to function. But it did something no human body could do, because it was inexhaustible. It worked day and night. It just kept going and going and going. And for a long time it looked that that would be all there would be. But at the start of the 1800s, so 200 years ago, a collection of people started to imagine, what if that power didn't just move machinery, it moved itself? What if we could take that engine and make it mobile? And people started to experiment with what we would now know as locomotives, so trains. And people started to work out, can we make that machine not just be stationary, but move? Can we turn fuel into power and power into motion? And for a long time, those trains, those early locomotives, were, in the vernacular of the time, shithouse. They were terrible. They didn't do very much. You could move faster than them. I could run faster than them in the 5-inch heels I am currently sporting. They weren't very good. But in 1839, at a place called Rainhill in England, a company held a competition called the Rainhill Trials. That company was called the Liverpool and Manchester Rail Line. It was a company that imagined itself into existence, because at the point they basically incorporated themselves as a company, there weren't any trains. But they called themselves a rail line anyway. And they held a competition to look for the fastest trains in Britain. And 5 trains turned up. Only one of them completed the trials over the period of a week. So 5 trains come to this competition, only one of them succeeds. That train was called the Rocket. It was the first rocket. It was built by a man named Stephenson. And on the day that rocket first ran, it was the fastest thing that had ever been on land. It went 40 miles an hour. It went faster than a human could go. It went faster than a horse could go. It went further, and it did it over and over again, and it did it pulling weight. And for the people of the Rainhill Trials, they looked around and went, I think I just saw the future. And so the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Company comes into existence. They build a whole lot of trains based on that Stephenson rocket. You can go still see it. Next time you're in London, you have to go to the British Science Museum, and in the auditorium, the atrium, the train is still there. It's yellow and shiny and kind of cool.
But it changed everything, right? Because suddenly a whole new set of businesses were built. So now you could move people and goods and services, and you could move them over distances that had been unimaginable. It also meant you had to do a whole lot of other things, like worry about safety. You had to create a standard for fares. You had to think about how did you acquire the land on which those trains would flow. You had to teach people how to drive them. You had to teach people how to be passengers in them. You had to think about how to make those engines more efficient, because when they were stationary, it didn't matter that they were really big and really heavy and really loud. Once they were moving, you needed to think about weight, because you couldn't put 2 stories of brick house on wheels and hope that would be successful. So you had to reimagine the engine. You had to make it more efficient, you had to make it more productive, you had to mean that it needed less fuel, which meant you actually had to invent things like the regulator and the governor to release steam out of the engine. So mechanical transformations, new business models. And then the story we often don't talk about with the invention of that train was that actually to make those trains function, because the Liverpool and Manchester line was just the first, a whole lot of other trains came into existence and a whole lot of other railways. Turned out you had this other critical problem, which is that there were more trains than there were lines, and so the trains had to share lines. And that meant you had to know when the next train was coming. And it turned out one of the things in Britain in 1839 was that every town had a different time. Time was where the sun was at the apex of the day. You set your clock at midday, and midday was when you could see the sun in Britain at the highest point in the day. That meant every town was a slightly different time. That meant you couldn't publish a train schedule, because if you published a train schedule, you couldn't know if it was accurate or not. And so that first railway company decided that they were going to create something called railway time. And at the front of every station, they put a clock. On every clock, they put something that they called railway time. And suddenly, all the towns in Britain had 2 time zones, local time and railway time. And you can imagine, because we all know the English, no one was going to capitulate in that fight. And so for 40 years, the towns of Britain had 2 time zones, railway time and local time. And it took an Act of Parliament in 1880 to standardise time across Britain and to make railway time standard time. And all the clocks had to change. So now you have a steam engine becoming a train, becoming a railway, becoming a whole set of business models, and changing the way the world worked. That same set of technologies comes to Australia. If you're from Albury-Wodonga, you know the consequences of what it meant to have trains and rail lines and a lack of communication about standards. If you were in America, those trains came and brought everything with them. The trains were the first things that went onto native country. They were the first appearances of all manner of things. Time went with those trains. They created new business models in America. It's how the first catalogue company came into existence. Sears and Roebuck's was a company that took advantage of empty rail carriages going back out of Chicago and filled it full of goods. Ice cream was invented by trains. Makes trains a really good thing in my book. And even after trains stopped being powered by steam engines, they kept building the world. In India, in China, in Japan, they created a whole way that we thought about time and space and people. And it all started with a steam engine on top of a mine in the 1700s. So why am I telling you all of that? Why should you get a lesson about trains today? Well, because I think one of the ways we should be thinking about the future of work has to do with that, at least as an informing historical story. I don't think history gives us the answers, but I think it lets us ask better questions. And my question these days is this: what if artificial intelligence, that thing we're all talking about, that thing that is in every newspaper, that governments keep saying is the answer to things, that I'm willing to bet someone has turned up in one of your companies recently and said to you, what you need is artificial intelligence? I bet it has. What if AI is just the steam engine? What if it's just the beginning? And what if the steam engine we're looking at here is the atmospheric one, not even the locomotive? What if we are at the beginning of a set of technological transformations, not the end state? And if that were true, what will the railway be? What's the metaphoric train? What are the ways that technology is going to change things? I can't tell you what the train will be. I'm not sure I can tell you what the moral equivalent of changing time will be. But I can tell you that artificial intelligence as a set of technologies that includes data and algorithms and learning techniques and sensing techniques and decision-making systems, those technologies will change the way computing functions. They will change what computing goes into. They will change buildings and cities and systems, and we're already seeing the first pieces of that. Whether we talk about cognitive augmentation, whether we talk about autonomous vehicles, those are all the steam engines, but they're not the train. So what might it look like, right? Well, there's a whole lot of questions we're going to have to answer. Will artificial intelligence mean that technology is now autonomous? Doesn't need us. And if we say autonomous, what do we actually mean by that? Lots of companies say they're building autonomous technologies, but every version of that is different. Tesla's autonomous mode means that every vehicle is connected to a central hub, and they operate mostly independently, but information pushes down into them. If we mean Volvo's fleet vehicles, they all communicate to each other in a horizontal plane, so they're not actually autonomous either. And oh, by the way, for vehicles to be autonomous, we need a better telecommunications network than we have. A heresy, I know. We need clearly demarcated and labelled roads and agreed to road rules. For those of you from Victoria, I think there is an open question about whether we will ever be able to teach an autonomous vehicle to do a hook turn. If only because that may actually be an irrational act. So we're going to have questions about autonomousness. What will it mean for those systems to operate without human control? And how will we feel about that? How will we signal it? What will the world look like when that's the case? If those systems are autonomous, how are we going to think about what the rules are that they learn? Who's responsible for teaching them? How those rules are transmitted? Who's keeping them? Whose rules they are? Are those rules local or global? We're going to have to think about what does it mean to talk about safety and security and liability and trust and risk and explicability. What will assurance mean when the systems make decisions absent human control? We're going to have to think about how we measure these systems. Trains were measured on speed and pulling capacity. Do we want to measure this next generation of machinery and automation on efficiency and productivity? Maybe not. Do we want to think about energy consumed? Do we want to think about better decision-making quality? Do we want to think about quality of human engagement? Those could all be measures. How are we going to engage with those systems? Most of us have spent the last 20 years engaging with technology through a screen or a keyboard. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, pretty narrow. What does it mean to imagine inhabiting a machine that's making decisions for you? What does it mean to live in a building that has just an idea about how you should be living? Most of you have encountered that. You've walked into a building, a tall building, possibly not in Canberra, where there was a panel of buttons to assign you to a lift. You have pressed a button, you have gone into that lift carriage, and there are no buttons inside the lift. Those of you who are mildly agoraphobic or control freaks, you will hate that. But it turns out that's the future. That lift has a better intention about how it should function, and doesn't need to tell you. And that's an interface, right? An interface that isn't an interface. So, what will the train look like? I don't know. But I can tell you that thinking about, will it be autonomous? How will it be controlled? How will we think about safety? How will we measure it? And how will we engage with it? Are the critical questions that will frame all of that. So, that's always a lot to think about, right? How do you manage all of that? Well, Kieran's been very gracious in talking about what I have been doing, but what I will be doing is answering those questions. So, I came home to Australia because in my heart and soul I will always be an Australian human being. I came home because the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University told me it was time to come home in a kind of appeal that only works once and he knows it. And I came home because I actually think that metaphoric railway system requires something we don't have yet. When railways came along, it made engineers. When computers came along, we made computer science. Whatever this new thing is going to require a whole new set of practitioners and a whole new set of skills. And so what we're doing at the Australian National University, what I'm doing in my institute, is building that. How do we build a new set of practitioners? How do we build a new body of knowledge? How do we build a new applied science? How do we find what the right questions to ask are? And how do we create the space to engage everyone who needs to be engaged with that? So the challenge about the future of business isn't about the pragmatics of tomorrow. We know what that's going to be like. The future of business is to ask the harder questions about not are we ready for AI, but are we ready for the train and the railway it will create, and oh, by the way, all the other consequences. And while those can sometimes sound a bit daunting before you actually have dinner, the good news is there is more opportunity and scope and scale there than there's been in 200 years. And the reality about futures like that is the best way to build a future we want to live in is to build it. We can be frightened about the notions of what AI might be. We can be worried about its consequences. As far as I'm concerned, the best way to make a future you want to live in is build it. So at some point you'll get an email from me asking for your help, and I hope you'll say yes. Because it turns out if you stood up and said, I'm going to build the future, you need all the help you can get. And I think accountants are on the hook as much as everyone else. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you.
Thank you.